I thought I had it all: a loving wife, a new marriage, and the promise of a bright future. Sarah and I had only been married a month. She was my dream woman, smart, beautiful, and endlessly charismatic. We tied the knot in a picturesque ceremony that felt like a fairy tale. Even more exciting, she was pregnant, a fact she revealed with teary eyes and a glowing smile just a week after our wedding. It felt like destiny. But that dream came crashing down one quiet Thursday evening. It started innocuously. I was sorting through some wedding photos on my laptop, hoping to create an album for our anniversary next year. Sarah had gone out to visit a friend, or so she said. As I sifted through the images, smiling at the candid moments we'd captured, I stumbled across a file I didn't recognize. It was buried in a folder labeled receipts on her flash drive, which I'd borrowed to retrieve a few honeymoon pictures. Curiosity got the better of me. I clicked on it. The video opened to a dimly lit room. At first, I thought it was some mundane recording, maybe a vlog or a forgotten clip. But then I saw them. My brother, David, and Sarah, seated together on what I recognized as the couch in his apartment. My heart started pounding as I watched her laugh at something he said, leaning closer than any sister-in-law should. I thought, no, it can't be what it looks like. But it was. The video wasn't explicit, but it didn't need to be. Their flirtatious behavior, the touches, the familiarity, it all screamed betrayal. At first, I told myself it could have been a mistake, or an old video from before we met. Maybe she'd forgotten about it. Maybe there was an explanation. But my gut told me otherwise. The date stamp on the video 2 days before our wedding. I couldn't sit still. My head buzzed with questions, accusations, and a deep sense of disbelief. Sarah had been my world. I thought back to the vows we'd exchanged just weeks ago, her promises of devotion and loyalty, the way she looked at me as if I were her everything. How could she say those words while keeping this secret? And David, my own brother, was the last person I'd ever suspect. I didn't confront her that night. I wanted to. Every cell in my body screamed for answers. But anger like that, unchecked, can lead to mistakes. So I waited, keeping my discovery locked away like a dark secret. When Sarah came home later that night, she was cheerful, her face glowing with the warmth of someone who had no idea the foundation of her world was about to crack. "How was the evening?" she asked, dropping her purse on the counter. "Fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Just looked through some wedding photos. Remembering the good times." Her expression softened, and she came over to hug me. "That's sweet. We've made so many great memories already, haven't we?" I nodded, my arms barely holding her back. Inside, I felt cold. "Anything interesting come up?" she asked casually, her voice light. "Not really," I lied. "Just trying to organize things a bit." The next few days were excruciating. Every glance she gave me, every affectionate gesture, felt tainted. My brother David wasn't helping either. He'd started dropping by more often than usual. At first, I thought it was just him being his carefree self, but now it felt calculated. I began to notice the way his eyes lingered on Sarah a bit too long, how their conversations flowed with an ease I'd never questioned before. I needed proof. That video alone wasn't enough, not for the confrontation I was planning. If I was going to bring this to light, I wanted it to be undeniable. One evening, I pretended to leave for work late, but instead parked my car down the street and doubled back to the house. I watched from the shadows as David's car pulled up not long after I'd left. Sarah greeted him at the door, her demeanor casual yet comfortable. Too comfortable. They didn't close the blinds. They probably didn't think they needed to. I stayed hidden and observed as they sat together on the couch, talking in low voices, leaning closer than they should. Then it happened. David placed his hand on her knee. She didn't move it away. Instead, she smiled. That was all I needed. When David left an hour later, I slipped back into the house as quietly as I could. Sarah was upstairs, humming to herself in the bathroom. She called out when she heard me come in. "Home already? That was quick." "Yeah," I said, my voice flat. As I stood in the living room, the faint smell of David's cologne still lingered in the air. My fists clenched. But I wasn't ready to strike just yet. Tomorrow, I'd start setting my trap. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and watching Sarah bustle about. She was animated, chatting about plans for the nursery and asking if I wanted to go with her to pick out paint samples that weekend. I could barely focus. My mind was consumed by the plan forming in my head. Confronting her outright wouldn't be enough. I needed to expose her, to destroy the cozy little world she and David had built behind my back. Sure, I replied absent-mindedly, as she rattled off ideas about themes for the baby's room. Let's do it. She smiled, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just below the surface. The first step was simple. I needed more evidence. Something undeniable. That evening, while Sarah showered, I quietly retrieved her phone. I'd always trusted her enough not to snoop, but now I didn't hesitate. My fingers shook as I unlocked it. Thankfully, I'd seen her passcode enough times to remember it. My stomach turned as I scrolled through her messages. There it was, a thread with David, hidden under a mundane contact name. David, work. The texts were subtle, nothing overtly incriminating at first glance, but the context made them scream with implication. David, did you like the flowers? Sarah loved them. You're too sweet. David, can't wait to see you again. I miss you. Sarah, me too. Soon, okay? I scrolled further. They spoke like two people entwined in something far deeper than a simple fling. The familiarity, the emojis, the pet names, it all felt like knives twisting in my chest. But it was the most recent exchange that made my blood run cold. David, what are we going to do about him? Sarah, he doesn't know anything. Just stay calm. That was enough. I put the phone back exactly where I found it, careful not to leave any evidence of my snooping. Later that night, while she slept, I pulled out my laptop and began compiling everything I'd gathered, the video, screenshots of their texts, and photos I'd discreetly taken during their encounters. Each piece of evidence felt like a nail in the coffin of the life I thought I had. But my plan wasn't just about confronting her or David. I wanted to make them suffer. To feel the weight of their betrayal as deeply as I felt it. The next morning, I paid a visit to a private investigator. He came recommended by a friend, someone discreet yet thorough. I handed over the evidence and explained what I wanted, more proof, the kind that couldn't be dismissed or denied. He nodded, jotting down notes. This kind of thing is messy, he said. But if they're being this careless, it shouldn't take long to get you what you need. I left his office feeling both vindicated and sickened. This wasn't who I was. I'd never imagined myself in a situation like this, plotting revenge against the two people who should have been closest to me. But they'd made their choice. A week later, the investigator called. I've got what you asked for, he said. Photos, audio, timestamps. It's all here. I drove to his office, my heart pounding the entire way. When I saw the folder he handed me, thick with damning evidence, I knew there was no turning back. Inside were photos of Sarah and David at his apartment, in his car, and even at a secluded park just outside town. One audio recording captured their voices clearly, laughing as they discussed plans to meet again. Does he suspect anything? David asked in one clip. No, Sarah replied, her tone confident. He's completely clueless. I closed the folder, my resolve hardening. They'd underestimated me. Good. Armed with the evidence, I began weaving the pieces of my plan together. A confrontation wasn't enough. I didn't just want them to squirm. I wanted to pull their world apart, thread by thread, the same way they'd unraveled mine. Sarah and David didn't deserve the luxury of privacy in their betrayal. They deserved to be exposed. That weekend, Sarah suggested we visit my parents. They've been asking about the baby, she said, her voice syrupy sweet. Great idea, I replied, forcing a smile. It was perfect. My parents would host the gathering, and David, of course, would be there. The family dinners had been a tradition for years, but this time, It would serve as the stage for their reckoning. I spent the days leading up to the dinner acting as if nothing was wrong, keeping Sarah oblivious. Every interaction with her was a test of my patience. I still kissed her goodnight, played the doting husband, and even indulged in her chatter about baby names. The morning of the dinner, I finalized my preparations. I'd created a digital presentation with the photos, texts, and audio recordings, pieced together like a horrific highlight reel. At the dinner, when the moment was right, it would play for everyone. The show wouldn't just be for Sarah and David. No, I wanted witnesses. When we arrived at my parents' house, everything felt painfully normal. My mom greeted us with hugs, my dad cracked a lame joke, and Sarah charmed them effortlessly, like the perfect daughter-in-law she pretended to be. David arrived shortly after, his smile wide and confident. Seeing his face made my skin crawl, but I kept my composure. The meal was lively, filled with laughter and stories. I sat quietly, watching them all, the family I thought I could trust. Sarah and David stole occasional glances at each other, but nothing overt. They were good at hiding it, I'd give them that. Finally, when dessert was served, I decided it was time. Before we finish up, I said, standing and raising my glass, I wanted to share something with everyone. The room fell quiet. Sarah looked up at me with a curious smile, while David froze, his expression flickering with unease. I've put together a little slideshow, I continued, walking over to the TV where my laptop was connected. It's a collection of moments that really capture what family means to me. The first image was harmless, a photo from our wedding day. The room sighed collectively, smiling as they reminisced. But the next slide silenced them. It was a photo of Sarah and David, sitting far too close on his couch, their faces lit with guilty smiles. What is this? Sarah asked, her voice sharp. Just keep watching, I said, my tone icy. The slides progressed, each more damning than the last. Photos of them meeting in secret, text messages where they spoke about me like I was an obstacle, and finally, the audio clip. David, does he suspect anything? Sarah, he's completely clueless. The room was dead silent by the time the presentation ended. My mother's face was pale, her hands trembling as she set down her wineglass. My father looked at David with a fury I'd never seen before. Sarah was the first to speak. You went through my phone? She snapped, her voice laced with panic. I turned to her, my face cold. You betrayed me. With my brother. Don't pretend like you're the victim here. David stammered, trying to explain, but my father cut him off. How could you do this? He demanded, his voice trembling with anger. To your own brother? It's not what it looks like, David said weakly, but no one was buying it. Sarah turned to me, tears streaming down her face. Please, we can fix this. Fix it? I interrupted, my voice sharp. There's nothing to fix. You made your choices, Sarah. Now you live with them. She sobbed, looking around the room for sympathy, but all she found was disgust. I didn't stay to watch the fallout. I grabbed my coat and left, leaving the chaos behind me. The drive home was quiet, but inside, I felt a strange sense of calm. This was only the beginning. By the time I got home, my phone was blowing up with calls and texts. Most were from Sarah. Please come back. We can talk about this. It's not what you think. Let me explain. I love you. Don't throw everything away over one mistake. Mistake. That word felt like acid in my veins. This wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was months of deceit and betrayal. I ignored her messages and poured myself a drink, relishing the silence of the house. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was walking on eggshells. The next morning, Sarah showed up at the house. I heard her car pull into the driveway and stayed seated at the kitchen table, waiting for her to knock. When she came in, her face was streaked with tears, her hands trembling. Please, Ryan, she begged. Let's talk. I folded my arms, leaning back in my chair. Talk about what, Sarah? About how you've been lying to me since the day we got married? Or how you've been sneaking around with my brother? Her face crumpled. It wasn't like that. Don't insult my intelligence, I snapped. I have all the proof I need. The photos, the messages, the audio. You've been caught. Just admit it. She sank into a chair, her hands clutching her stomach. I was scared, she said softly. When I found out I was pregnant, I panicked. I didn't know if it was yours or his. But I chose you because I loved you, because I wanted us to work. My heart turned to ice. So you're telling me there's a chance this baby isn't mine? She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I don't know, Ryan. I thought it didn't matter, because we were starting our life together, and I wanted it to be with you. Her words were a dagger to my chest. The baby, the one thing I clung to as a symbol of our future, might not even be mine. I stood, pacing the kitchen to keep from exploding. We're getting a paternity test, I said firmly. If you think for 1 second I'm going to raise another man's child while you parade around pretending everything is fine, you're delusional. Ryan, please, she sobbed, reaching for me. I love you. I made a mistake, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this. I pulled away from her touch. I don't want your love, Sarah. I want the truth. And after that, I want you out of my life. Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't care. My resolve was steel. She had shattered my trust, destroyed the family we were building, and dragged my brother into the wreckage. The next step was clear. I needed to confront David. That afternoon, I drove to his apartment. He didn't answer when I knocked, so I called him, standing in the hallway with my fists clenched. When he finally picked up, his voice was hesitant. Hey, Ryan. I'm outside, I said coldly. Open the door. A pause. Then the lock clicked, and he opened the door just enough for me to see his face. Can we talk? He asked, his tone pleading. I pushed past him into the apartment. We're past talking, David. What the hell were you thinking? Sleeping with my wife? Lying to my face for months? He closed the door and leaned against it, looking at the floor. I didn't mean for it to happen. It got out of hand. I laughed bitterly. Out of hand? Is that what you call betraying your own brother? I never wanted to hurt you, he said, his voice cracking. It was a mistake. That's what she said. I shot back. But you know what? I don't care about your excuses. I don't care about your regrets. You've destroyed this family. David looked up at me, his face pale. What do you want me to do? I took a step closer, my voice low and deadly. Stay away from me. Stay away from Sarah. And if I find out you've contacted her again, I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of man you really are. He swallowed hard but didn't argue. I'm sorry, he whispered. Sorry doesn't cut it, I said, turning to leave. As I walked out the door, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. David's guilt was written all over his face, and I intended to make sure it haunted him for the rest of his life. But the hardest part was still ahead, finding out the truth about the baby. The paternity test was my last thread of hope, though at this point, hope felt like a fool's game. Deep down, I already knew the answer. But I needed to see it in black and white, no room for doubt or excuses. Sarah agreed to the test without much resistance, her guilt too overwhelming to argue. The clinic visit was tense, silent. She sat across from me in the waiting room, wringing her hands and stealing glances at me, but I refused to meet her eyes. The nurse took the samples quickly, mine, Sarah's, and hers for the baby. She was far enough along for a prenatal test, and within minutes, it was over. Results in 3 days, the nurse said with a polite smile. Those 3 days felt like years. Sarah stayed at her mother's house during that time, sending occasional texts that I ignored. I poured myself into work, trying to keep my mind occupied, but it was useless. The thoughts kept creeping back, dragging me into the same cycle of anger and despair. On the 3rd day, the clinic called. Mr. Ryan, your results are ready, the receptionist said. Would you like to come in, or should we email them? I'll come in, I said, my voice tight. The drive to the clinic was nerve-wracking. By the time I reached the office, my hands were slick with sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The receptionist handed me a sealed envelope, her expression neutral. I sat in my car, staring at it for what felt like an eternity. Finally, I ripped it open. The words hit me like a sledgehammer. Probability of paternity, 0%. My hands trembled as I read it again and again, hoping I'd somehow misunderstood. But there it was. The baby, the one Sarah and I had celebrated as a symbol of our future, wasn't mine. I drove home in a haze, my mind spinning. This wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was annihilation. The life I thought we were building had been a lie from the start. That evening, Sarah called. I didn't answer. Instead, I texted her a photo of the test results. We're done. Don't come back. Her response came quickly. Ryan, please. Let's talk about this. I made a mistake, but we can get through it. I didn't reply. The next day, I met with my lawyer to start the divorce process. He was thorough, helping me navigate the steps needed to protect myself. Given the circumstances, he said, flipping through his notes, you'll likely have a strong case for an uncontested divorce. Especially with the evidence you've provided. Good. I wanted this over as quickly as possible. But divorce wasn't enough. I wanted revenge, real, crushing revenge. Sarah and David had taken everything from me, my trust, my family, even the future I thought was mine. I started to reach out to my closest friends, subtly sharing pieces of the story. Words spread quickly, and soon enough, Sarah's perfect image began to crumble. People who once adored her now looked at her with disdain. But the real blow came when I paid David another visit. This time, I wasn't there to yell or make threats. I had something far more sinister in mind. David answered the door, looking worse for wear. His usually polished appearance was gone, his hair disheveled, his eyes bloodshot. What do you want? He asked, his voice wary. I'm here to make a deal, I said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He frowned. What kind of deal? Sarah's pregnant, I said, watching his face carefully. He froze. What are you talking about? It's yours, David. The paternity test confirmed it. His face went pale, his mouth opening and closing like he was searching for words. Here's the deal, I continued, my voice cold. You take responsibility for her and the baby. You step up, own what you've done, and make this right. Otherwise, I'll make sure everyone, including your boss, knows exactly who you are. His expression shifted from panic to anger. You can't force me to do anything. Oh, I think I can, I said, pulling out my phone. I've got enough evidence to ruin you, David. And believe me, I won't hesitate to use it. He stared at me, his jaw clenched. Finally, he nodded. Fine. I'll take care of it. Good, I said, heading for the door. Because I'm done cleaning up your messes. As I left, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. David wanted my life? Fine. He could have the mess Sarah left behind. The pieces were falling into place. Sarah and David, the two people who had destroyed my life, were now stuck in a web of their own making. David was cornered, forced to accept responsibility for the baby he'd helped create. And Sarah? Her reputation was crumbling by the day. But I wasn't done. Not yet. I wanted to make sure the fallout was complete, that there was no escape for either of them. I started to dig deeper into David's life, looking for vulnerabilities I could exploit. It didn't take long to find them. David was on thin ice at work, his flashy lifestyle supported by a job he barely held onto. A quick conversation with one of his former colleagues revealed just how precarious his position was. He's been skating by on charm for years, the colleague said. One screw-up and he's out. Perfect. That evening, I compiled a package of evidence, photos, texts, audio clips, and even a timeline of events. I sent it anonymously to David's boss, framing it as a concerned tip about his lack of professionalism. Within days, I heard through the grapevine that David had been called into a disciplinary meeting. By the end of the week, he'd been fired. Sarah, meanwhile, had been reaching out incessantly, leaving voicemails filled with pleas and apologies. "Ryan, I know I hurt you, but please, don't throw away everything we've built. I still love you. The baby doesn't change how I feel about us. We can get through this. Please call me back. I'm begging you." Her desperation was palpable, but I didn't respond. I let her words hang in the void, knowing she was unraveling with every passing day. Then came the breaking point. A mutual friend called me one evening, her voice hesitant. "Ryan, have you seen Sarah's latest post?" "No," I replied, confused. "What post?" "She made a statement on social media," the friend said. "About everything." I pulled up Sarah's profile, my stomach twisting. There it was, a long, emotional post laying out her version of events. She didn't name David, but she alluded to an affair, and claimed she was taking steps to rebuild trust and move forward. It was a carefully crafted narrative, designed to paint her as remorseful and misunderstood. She even played the victim, talking about how the private details of her life had been exposed without consent. Rage boiled inside me. She was trying to twist the story, to rewrite the truth in her favor. I wasn't about to let her get away with it. The next day, I launched the final phase of my plan. First, I sent copies of the evidence package to key figures in Sarah's professional network, her boss, her colleagues, even a few clients she'd worked closely with. I framed it as a warning about her character, attaching just enough proof to make it undeniable. The fallout was swift. Within a week, Sarah's company announced her resignation, citing personal reasons. Her carefully curated career was in shambles. But I wasn't done. Next, I shared the full story with our extended family, cousins, aunts, uncles, leaving nothing out. The scandal spread like wildfire, turning every family gathering into a minefield for Sarah and David. By the time I was done, they were pariahs, isolated and ostracized. One evening, Sarah showed up at the house unannounced, her face pale and drawn. She looked like a shadow of the woman I once knew. "Ryan," she said softly, tears brimming in her eyes. "Can we please talk?" I leaned against the doorway, blocking her from entering. "What is there to talk about, Sarah? You made your choices," she sobbed, clutching at her stomach. "I've lost everything. My job, my reputation. You've taken it all from me." "No," I said coldly. "You did that to yourself. You destroyed this family, and now you're paying the price." Her voice cracked. "But the baby, Ryan, what about the baby? It's not fair to punish." I cut her off. "That's David's problem now. You two deserve each other." I shut the door in her face, her cries muffled on the other side. As I stood in the empty hallway, I felt a strange mix of emotions, satisfaction, sorrow, and an overwhelming sense of closure. The trap had sprung, and they were caught in it. The days after Sarah's breakdown at my door were quiet. Too quiet. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. She hadn't tried contacting me, and David was a ghost. The chaos I'd unleashed had finally settled, leaving behind an eerie calm. But the aftermath wasn't without its challenges. The house felt emptier than ever. Every corner was a reminder of the life I thought I had, the future I'd been building. The baby's nursery, half finished, was the worst of it. I closed the door and left it untouched. The divorce process moved quickly, thanks to the mountain of evidence my lawyer had gathered. Sarah didn't fight it, she didn't have the strength. By the time the papers were finalized, I'd cut her out of my life entirely. But the real surprise came from David. One afternoon, I received a call from my father. His voice was tense, hesitant. "We need to talk about your brother," he said. "What about him?" I replied, already bracing myself. "He's in bad shape. He lost his job, his apartment. Everything. He moved back home with us. Your mother's worried." I snorted. "Sounds like karma to me." "Ryan," my father said firmly, "I know you're angry. I don't blame you. But he's still your brother. He stopped being my brother the moment he betrayed me. I snapped. There was a long silence before my father sighed. I'm not asking you to forgive him. But maybe you could come to dinner, at least try to talk things out. No, I said flatly. I'm done with him. And I'm done with this conversation. I hung up, the knot in my chest tightening. Later that evening, I sat on the couch, staring at the TV without really watching it. My phone buzzed, and I almost ignored it, until I saw the name on the screen. David. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the answer button. Finally, I picked up, my voice cold. What do you want? I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, he began, his voice shaky. But I needed to say this. I'm sorry. For everything. I laughed bitterly. Sorry doesn't fix what you did, David. Sorry doesn't give me back my marriage, or the life you destroyed. I know, he said quickly. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I wanted you to know how much I regret it. I've lost everything, Ryan. My job, my reputation, my relationship with you. And Sarah. What about Sarah? I asked sharply. She's a mess, he said, his voice dropping. She blames me for everything. The baby, the fallout, the family turning against her. She says I ruined her life. I leaned back, the pieces clicking into place. So, you two are still talking? We're trying to figure things out, he admitted. For the baby's sake. I shook my head, a bitter smile tugging at my lips. You wanted her so badly, David. Now you've got her. Congratulations. Ryan, please, he said, his voice breaking. I just want us to move on. To find some kind of peace. I thought about it for a long moment, the silence stretching between us. Finally I spoke. You made your bed, David. Now lie in it. Don't call me again. I hung up, my heart pounding. That night, I went through the evidence one last time. The photos, the texts, the videos, they were all still there, tucked away in a folder on my computer. I should have deleted them. I should have let it go. But I couldn't. They were a reminder, a scar, a warning never to trust so blindly again. As I stared at the screen, a thought crossed my mind. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about making sure I never forgot what they'd done. I closed the laptop, the room falling into darkness. Weeks turned into months, and life slowly found a semblance of normalcy. The divorce was finalized, my ties to Sarah officially severed. David's name became a ghost in my family, spoken in hushed tones, if at all. My parents tried to mediate, to bring me back into the fold, but I refused. There was no fixing what he'd done. As for Sarah, she faded from my world entirely. The few mutual friends who still spoke to her told me she'd moved in with her mother and was focusing on her pregnancy. I didn't ask for details. I didn't care. My focus shifted entirely to rebuilding my life. I took on more hours at work, spent weekends hiking or hitting the gym, anything to keep my mind from wandering back to what I'd lost. But despite my best efforts, the emptiness lingered. Late at night, when the house was too quiet, I'd catch myself replaying everything in my mind, the lies, the betrayal, the fallout. It was like a wound that refused to heal. One evening, as I was scrolling through my emails, a message caught my eye. It was from Sarah. The subject line read, "For what it's worth." I hesitated, my finger hovering over the delete button. But curiosity got the better of me. The email was short, barely 3 sentences. Ryan, I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I'm sorry. Truly. I've made a lot of mistakes, and I've paid for them in ways you'll never understand. But I'll always regret losing you. Sarah. I stared at the screen, my emotions a tangled mess. Part of me wanted to reply, to tell her exactly how much damage she'd caused. Another part wanted to block her email entirely. In the end, I did neither. I closed the laptop and went to bed. The following week, I ran into an old friend at a bar. Liam, a buddy I hadn't seen in years, was nursing a drink at the counter. He waved me over, and soon we were reminiscing about old times, catching up on everything we'd missed in each other's lives. Eventually, the conversation turned to Sarah. "Man, I heard about what happened," Liam said, his voice low. "That's rough. You doing okay?" I shrugged, taking a sip of my beer. "As good as I can be." He nodded thoughtfully, then leaned closer. "You know, it's crazy how people like that think they can get away with it. Like, no consequences, no fallout." I smirked. "Oh, they felt the consequences. Believe me." Liam raised an eyebrow. "What did you do?" I hesitated, then told him everything, the evidence, the family dinner, the fallout that followed. His eyes widened as I recounted the details, a mix of shock and admiration on his face. "Damn," he said when I finished. "You really went scorched earth on them." "Had to," I replied, my voice steady. "They deserved it." Liam nodded, but his expression shifted to something more serious. "Just be careful, man. Revenge feels good in the moment, but it doesn't fix what's broken. You don't want to carry that weight forever." His words lingered with me long after I left the bar. One morning, as I was heading out for a run, I saw an unfamiliar car parked outside my house. At first, I thought it was a delivery driver or someone lost, but then I noticed the figure sitting in the driver's seat. It was Sarah. She looked worn, her face pale and drawn. Her hands were clasped tightly on the steering wheel, her knuckles white. For a moment, she just stared at me, as if debating whether to step out. Finally, she opened the door and approached me hesitantly. "What are you doing here?" I asked coldly. "I needed to see you," she said, her voice trembling. "Just for a minute. Please." I sighed, crossing my arms. "You've got 1 minute." She hesitated, then blurted out. "The baby's here. I thought you should know." My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to stay composed. "And? She swallowed hard. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. Again. For everything. And to let you know that I'll keep my distance. You don't have to worry about me or the baby. I won't complicate your life anymore." I studied her, searching for any sign of manipulation, but all I saw was exhaustion. "Good," I said finally. "Because you've done enough damage." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I know." Without another word, she turned and walked back to her car. I watched as she drove away, a strange emptiness settling in my chest. She was gone. For good this time. Months passed. The chaos that had defined my life for so long began to fade, replaced by a quiet, almost unsettling calm. I'd cut Sarah and David out completely, and with them gone, I thought I could finally move forward. But the scars were still there. Every time I passed the unfinished nursery, every time someone asked if I was dating again, every time a photo from the wedding popped up on my phone, the memories came rushing back. The betrayal, the anger, the humiliation, it clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. I told myself I'd done the right thing. I'd exposed the truth, held them accountable, and taken control of my life again. But Liam's words kept echoing in my mind. Revenge feels good in the moment, but it doesn't fix what's broken. One evening, as I was cleaning out the attic, I found the box. It was full of Sarah's things, letters, mementos, keepsakes from the early days of our relationship. At the bottom was the folder of evidence I'd gathered against her and David. I sat there, staring at it, my mind racing. For months, I clung to these remnants of the past, using them as fuel for my anger. But now, they felt like dead weight. I took the folder downstairs, tossed it into the fireplace, and watched as the flames consumed it. The next day, I received an unexpected call. "Ryan, it's David," the voice on the other end said, hesitant. I almost hung up, but something stopped me. "What do you want?" I asked flatly. I just wanted to tell you that I'm leaving town," he said. "I got a job offer out of state. It's a fresh start. For me and Sarah." I froze. "Sarah's going with you?" "She thinks it's best for the baby," he replied. "And honestly, I think she just wants to get away from everything." For a moment, I didn't say anything. Then I exhaled slowly. Good. Maybe this time you won't screw it up. David sighed. I know you'll never forgive me, Ryan. I don't expect you to. But I'm sorry. For what it's worth. It's worth nothing, I said coldly. Goodbye, David. I hung up, a strange sense of finality settling over me. A week later, I got a letter in the mail. It was from Sarah, her handwriting neat but unsteady. Ryan. By the time you read this, David and I will be gone. I don't know if we'll ever cross paths again, but I wanted to leave you with one last thing before we go. A truth I owe you. The baby isn't David's. I thought it was for a while, and I let my fear guide my decisions. But I took my own test after you shut me out, and the results confirmed it. The baby is yours, Ryan. He's healthy and beautiful, and I'll raise him the best I can. I promise you that. I'm not telling you this to change anything. I just thought you deserved to know. For what it's worth, I'll always regret what I did to you. Sarah. My hands shook as I read the letter, the words blurring in front of me. The baby was mine. For a long time, I sat there, staring at the page. Part of me wanted to call her, to demand an explanation. But another part of me knew it didn't matter. The damage was done. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. That night, as I stood in the nursery, I finally opened the door. The room was quiet, bathed in soft moonlight. It wasn't empty, not really. Because for the first time in a long time, I felt something stir inside me. Hope.